Good evening. Happy Thursday. It's March 12th, 2026. And this evening, I have a message that's been on my heart and in my thoughts for quite some time. But it just wasn't quite the right time to express it. There are other things that needed to take place before it was the right time to express it. And I can feel that that time is right now. All these events happening. Over the past 8 to 10 years, especially, here in the United States and Canada, and in the UK and Australia, especially, there's been a lot of interest in gluten-free foods and gut health, inflammation, autoimmune disorders, and mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, and how gluten consumption may affect people on the autism spectrum. There's been a lot of research that has been done, especially since 2014. Some of the most groundbreaking research we've seen has been over the past 5 years or so, 2020, 2021, and beyond. In my gluten-free research, one of the things that I've noticed very strongly as I visited a lot of the social media groups, the social media gluten-free, celiac, non-celiac gluten sensitivity forums, it has to do with how many new diagnoses that are popping up, especially in the United States and Canada and in other places in the world. Places like the UK and Australia and Italy, Scandinavia, the United Kingdom, Australia. But there have been other people that have been affected as well that the research has not focused on. Places in Africa and other ethnicities as well are affected by this as well, that I've noticed in my research. So this is something that's affecting people all over the world. But what's become very noticeable is it's affecting people more disproportionately in places where there's been extensive hybridization of wheat. And it just so happens that in those places where there's extensive hybridization of wheat and genetic modification, that in those countries and those parts of the world, ultra processed foods are very popular. They're highly advertised and marketed, very available, and they're marketed to the populations who are more disproportionately affected in an adverse way by gluten consumption. In my early research, one of the first things that I began to notice as I spoke to so many people who were trying to eliminate gluten from their diet was that there seemed to be an addiction. It was very hard for people, including myself, to stop eating gluten. That it would feel like it would call you back, and that it didn't. Foods that didn't contain gluten didn't taste the same. And at first it was hard to get full, that feeling of being satisfied. Many people have reported that when they eliminate gluten from their diet, it seems like they just can't get full, that feeling of satisfaction from food. And there are so many people that were reporting feelings of depression when they eliminated gluten from their diet. And it also creates a social wedge for so many people and families that are where there's maybe one person who is eating gluten-free and the rest of the family is not. In my research through looking at the different medical journals and scientific journals is that there are real chemical, physiological reasons that people are experiencing these symptoms that make it difficult for them to relate to people who have eliminated gluten from their diet. It creates real changes in the psychology. The way that the gluten breaks down in the body, it affects the neurotransmitters differently. There are changes in the way that the brain processes whenever gluten enters the picture. So when the body has become used to ingesting large amounts and greater amounts of gluten, the compounds that the gluten breaks down into, the glutenine and the gliadin, they break down into compounds that ping the opioid receptors in the body. And these opioid receptors are called gluteomorphins. And when they ping these receptors, the feeling that it causes the person to feel is pain relief, euphoria, sometimes brain fog, it can cause people to become less aware, more distractible, more susceptible to mental manipulation, mind control. During my research, several research papers have shown that this effect increases in intensity with increased consumption of gluten. So as a person eats more of this gluten, there's more of it available to break down into these compounds that are taken up by the gluteomorphins, these opioid receptors in the body, which intensifies the brain fog effect, the suggestibility, that euphoria that makes it possible to control masses of people. And you end up with the situation back in ancient Rome with the breads and circuses, how bread and entertainment was used to placate people who were growing more and more disturbed, unhappy, bothered by the injustices that were taking place. The injustices afflicted on the people by the ruling classes. They were feeding bread. They even learned back then that there was something about the bread, something in the wheat, in the bread, that would lull them into a sense of, I don't care as long as you give me more bread, more beer, and entertainment to keep me distracted. The bread, not only did it make them feel more satisfied, but it caused them to become more lethargic and agreeable to even injustices. And in my research, and after studying over many research papers that go from the recent years all the way back to 1953, when it was first discovered scientifically that the consumption of certain carbohydrates especially could lend itself to certain mental disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disease, and so on. And for some reason, that information was later hidden and forgotten about until recently. So one of the most recent things that's been fascinating me, it has to do with the parable of the weeds and the wheat, where Jesus was teaching using the illustration about a farmer who had gone out and sowed fine seed on fine soil. And this was supposed to be a wheat crop. So it was fine wheat seed on fine soil. And he went to bed, and overnight, a vandal came in and oversowed weeds over the crop. And that was an important detail, that the farmer had gone to sleep, and this had happened in the dark of night, where the vandal came in intentionally to cause a problem. He didn't want the farmer to realize that it had happened. And so he didn't realize that it happened right away until the seeds started to sprout. And once they started to come up, he realized, like, hey, there's more here coming up than what I planted. Somebody came in, he probably saw some footsteps out there that weren't his or that weren't theirs, and he realized that something had happened, but didn't know exactly what until they started sprouting up. And he realized at that point that there were things that were sprouting up that did not look exactly like the wheat seeds. But from my experience growing gardens, when the sprouts first come up, if you've planted several seeds in a spot and you try to thin them out too soon, you'll pull out good seedlings. They're not firmly anchored in the ground yet, and the root systems can pull another plant out. So it wasn't the right time for them to pluck out what looked like weeds yet. So the suggestion was to allow them to grow together for a while. Later on, when the plants were a little bit bigger and stronger, and it was easier to identify which seeds were the wheat and the weeds, that they could separate them out. Well, there's another twist to this situation, and I understand the spiritual interpretation of that parable. It has to do with counterfeiting the truth. How in the last days, especially, in the last days, there would be teachers that would cloak themselves to be of God, but that they were counterfeit in order to rope people in and mislead them to a path of destruction, to take them off of the path that leads to salvation. And we definitely see that right now too. So I'm not attempting to replace the spiritual interpretation of that parable, but I'm seeing that there's another parallel in that story, especially with today's food system. And it doesn't contradict, it doesn't disagree, it supports the original interpretation as a tool that someone who is trying to make themselves appear to be an angel of light, a beacon leading people to salvation, so they would cloak themselves, morph themselves. They would pretend to be something that was healthy and wholesome. So there's another layer here. This would be even more insidious than planting an actual different type of plant, a weed, in along the wheat seed. But this would be like somebody taking a real wheat seed and genetically modifying it so much so that it looks like wheat, it tastes like wheat, but it's not wheat because wheat is not made to destroy. But this particular product is not even easily digestible. And this particular product that tastes like wheat and looks like wheat and bakes like wheat and cooks like it too. There's something about it that the body cannot process. In fact, when it does break it down, there are aspects of this Franken gluten, this Franken wheat, that causes the body to attack itself. It triggers autoimmune responses. The gluten strands that come from this genetically modified wheat that we find in our food system now, especially in countries and parts of the world where ultra-processed foods are heavily marketed and targeted to susceptible, vulnerable populations. And with the research that has been coming out that shows the effect, the detrimental effects of gluten addiction, even gluten consumption for people who have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity or Crohn's disease, various autoimmune diseases like lupus and diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, chronic pain disorders, inflammation, depressive disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, anxiety. It goes on and on and on, and all of these documents and documents of research in journals, scientific journals, medical journals, have connected all of these problems, these disorders, ailments, to gluten consumption. And all the references are there. I'll list several references for you to look up yourself. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's had an effect on the population that, because of the very nature of how it works, that food could actually be turned against us and used as a delivery method to facilitate manipulation, deception, lethargy, apathy, confusion, unpredictability and chaos, illness. A way to keep people so preoccupied, to keep people stuck in a preoccupation of the next fix for the addiction. More flavor, more euphoria, to distract people away from the pain that is being inflicted by the injustices and the socioeconomic inequality. There's a scripture that's coming to mind right now. I'm not remembering the exact scripture off the top of my head, but it goes, "Why do you keep paying for what is not bread?" In effect, this is not bread that is made from this Franken wheat, this wheat that has been genetically engineered to the point that the body can barely digest it. And when it does start to break it down, it causes the body to attack itself with autoimmune responses and inflammation and so on and so forth. And that's not even taking into consideration the effects that it has on the psyche. So this is another layer to the weeds and the wheat story. And in fact, if you think about it, in a way, it's even more insidious because it's an extreme deception to take something that started out as wheat and then genetically engineering it, people wouldn't be buying it if it didn't look like wheat, taste like wheat, and perform like wheat. And people wouldn't be buying as much of it if it wasn't so convenient and they didn't make it taste so extra good. And they weren't able to mass produce it to the point where there's so much supply that it drove the price way down. And then all the marketing to make people feel like they have to have it and that it's going to make their life easier. So let's go ahead and make convenience foods and sell it to people as something premium. What a deception, especially when you consider how detrimental of an effect tricking people into addiction. Just trace it back since ultra-processed foods first started becoming popular. And you can look at the trends and the relationships between all these trends. And you can look at the money, follow the money. The processed food industry and the pharmaceutical industry. And certain mergers between pharmaceutical or tobacco companies and food companies. And you'll understand why they did it. There's a synergy there. But once you go deeper, and time has proven this, just how detrimental of an effect this synergy has been. It was prophesied. You can see why this is so problematic, and you can see why it feels like a deception that you eat. That this protein, the way that it breaks down or doesn't want to break down in the body, not only does it taste good and it imparts characteristics to the food that make the texture more inviting, but once it breaks down, it does two very insidious things. On one hand, it can trigger autoimmune responses in the body and inflammation. But then the other half of the gluten protein has an anesthetic effect. So it can go around causing damage in the body and pain in the body, and then try to cover it up by anesthetizing it so that the person who's consuming it, they keep wanting more of something that's causing damage in their body because it's hiding the pain, even numbing the pain and causing euphoria. So the thing that makes this gluten, and especially this Franken gluten, so problematic is that it does two contradicting things that really feel like deception. And if you ask me, it feels a bit evil even, without anthropomorphizing it too much. On one hand, this gluten protein imparts characteristics to food that enhance the texture, like making it more elastic and making things more cohesive in your breads and your sauces and things like that. And it also enhances flavors as well. But then the thing that makes it so dangerous is that there's an aspect that when it breaks down, it can trigger autoimmune responses and inflammation. But then it turns around and tries to cover up the pain by anesthetizing it and even causing euphoria and making somebody want more of something that's wreaking havoc on their body. And that definitely seems like something that could be weaponized by a vandal that would want to use something that has been consumed as a food and genetically modifying it and hybridizing it so that it passes as food. And it's hardier and it accepts fertilizers better so that it increases the yield and increases the supply, which would bring down the prices. And it makes all of these components more attractive to the ultra-processed food industry. And the more of this gluten that they can pump into the food in all these different ways, as binders for color, as binders for sauces, as additives to make the pizza dough stretchier, as flavor enhancers, as extra protein, marketing it as extra protein in the flour. Right now, there's quite a protein craze going on. People are wanting more protein. And after all, gluten is a protein. It's a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. But gluten is definitely a different type of protein. And once it's been genetically engineered and hybridized the way that it has been, in theory, it can be weaponized. There's lots of research, scientific and medical research, to show it. And you can see for yourself. So this situation is a situation that it really is like an elephant in the room. It's been hiding right here in plain sight. And many people have not realized that it's been happening. And it's because baked goods, especially baked goods that contain wheat, rye, or barley, they're so comforting. And we usually consume them during holidays or festive moments, parties, celebrations. And there's so much emotion around the consumption of baked goods. There's definitely an emotional component to gluten consumption that goes beyond just the context around the consumption of it. It's part of the chemical makeup of the protein, the way that it breaks down. It has a psychological, emotional effect. When you're eating something that breaks down and pings the opioid receptors in the body, we know what morphine does. When people develop a tolerance to morphine or codeine, and then they don't have access to it, what it does. Now, that's more extreme because the effect of the gluteomorphins, it's a weaker feeling, but it's cumulative. The more gluten you eat, the effect accumulates. You may not feel like you're eating so much of it to have an effect, but when gluten is put in all these ultra-processed foods in so many different ways, you're getting lots and lots of it, and in tiny little doses, that the addiction starts and it develops and it takes root. And people become addicted to gluten way before they know it. And they don't realize they're addicted to the gluten until they realize that they have to give it up. And that's when it becomes a problem.